Hey guys, in this video I want to talk about MeshBrush's Runtime API and how to set up things in order to make it work at runtime and still maintain a pleasant development environment. So let's start by just pressing play in this test scene that ships with MeshBrush. With your mouse over the terrain, press P and see how some random meshes get placed on it. Now this looks neat, doesn't it? But how do we achieve that? Well, let's open up these two scripts here. Here we have the MeshBrush Runtime API script, which contains all of the variables and methods needed to paint meshes at runtime. And there we have the actual example script for the runtime usage. Let's start with the API script. This entire part here on the top of the script is dedicated to the variables. Let's take a look at some of them. This here is the public array of game objects to paint at runtime, also known as the set of meshes to paint in the editor's MeshBrush. In here you will assign the set of meshes you are going to paint. Make sure not to leave any empty fields in it. Then we have some private variables. These are needed for the painting algorithms, like for instance the painting brush, which at runtime is invisible. Here we have the holder object. All painted meshes will be parented to it, and this is its transform. This property here is the amount of meshes to paint. This one is the delay between paint strokes, basically defining the speed at which meshes will be painted. This is the also invisible brush radius. The meshes will get placed inside an invisible circle area, exactly like in the editor, except that you in fact cannot see the actual circle handle. What you could do, for instance, is create your own custom GUI circle brush and adapt it by accessing these variables, but that is up to you. Also note that I did not make these fields serialized into the inspector, and there's a reason for that. Since each one of you developers has its stuff set up differently from each other, you will have to access these variables from various places in your code. You could also make them editable in the inspector, but I think it's better to find your own way of setting up the runtime painting functions. Besides, you need to create an instance of this class on at least one game object in your scene anyway, so accessing these variables will be a piece of cake. Down here we have the various other settings we already discussed in the other tutorial video. They do exactly the same things as they do in the editor's MeshBrush version, so make sure to check out that video in case you don't already know. Here's the region with the actual painting methods. You pass in a raycast_hit parameter, but you can change this to anything that suits your situation. But usually I think this is gonna be a raycast_hit. Single mesh paint and multiple mesh paint are two separate methods. When you call them and pass in the parameter, they will use the above defined set of meshes to paint, brush radius and so on to paint your meshes. So make sure to set those up very carefully. You could for instance create some fancy GUI to drive the values of them through the player. Now let's go over to the example script. In this setup we will attach a MeshBrush API component and an example script instance component onto the same game object. So first, in here we want a reference to that API script. There's no need for it to be public. We'll just use getComponent once in the awake function and initialize the reference. In here we set up our references and start the painting coroutine. As you can see, I set up the API's variables in the start method here. Clearly, this is not the best way of doing things, but this is just for demonstrational purposes. In a real-life scenario, one would probably want to drive those values with a good GUI of some sort. Here we have the radius of 10 meters, 7 meshes to paint per stroke, 0.2 seconds of delay between paint strokes, and so on. We use a vector4 variable for the random scale, by the way. The x and y components represent the minimum and maximum width of the painted meshes, whereas the z and w components stand for the minimum maximum height. MeshBrush will pick a random value between each minimum and maximum value in here to randomly scale your meshes. And here's the final painting coroutine. In here we check for the player's input, in this case the P button, but you can choose anything in here. Then we shoot a ray through the mouse position, and if we hit something, we paint meshes onto it. To do so, we call the paint multiple meshes method in the API script, with the mouse raycast hit info as a parameter. Then we pause the coroutine and resume it shortly after, basically when delay seconds have passed. This is almost everything actually. You programmers out there can have fun reading through this code and adapting it to your projects. I tried to make this API as versatile as possible, and I really hope you like it. As I mentioned before, each developer has different game structure setups, which is why I created this as minimal as you see it here. You can do all sorts of adaptations with this though. You could, for instance, come up with a neat pool solution, where you would use lists to pool the game objects before painting them in order to reduce performance overhead at runtime. For more information on object pooling, check out the link in the description below. There's an awesome official Unity tutorial on how to do this kind of thing. But MeshBrush is open to extensions of any type, so feel free to edit it and adapt it to your project as good as you can. So, this is it. Thanks for watching and merry game development. Cheers!